Remember the global war on terror after 9/11? Now, journalist Ken Klippenstein says we are living through a domestic war on terror. In his latest Substack post, Klippenstein highlights how the second Trump administration is going after Americans. The recent torrent of vandalism at Tesla dealerships prompted Attorney General Pam Bondi to declare that an act of terrorism. President Trump doubled down, saying in a March 11th press conference that Tesla vandals should be labelled domestic terrorists, warning they're, quote, gonna go through hell.
College protesters and universities are facing crackdowns as well. In early March, Trump said he would jail and deport students over what he deems illegal protests, along with threats to withhold millions from Columbia University. Joining us now to discuss all of this is Ken Klippenstein, co-founder of Clip News. Welcome, Ken, to the program.
Hey guys, good to be back.
So I take it you're not overly enthusiastic about some of these moves from the Trump administration, which I confess, although I have been somewhat supportive or more supportive of Trump this time around than I expected, I similarly do not like to deport people without due process or clamp down on protesting. And I think the agenda will be going awry if we quickly give in to these, obviously authoritarian tendencies do not hold up well. What's your take on all this?
Yeah, just yesterday, Attorney General Pam Bondi reiterated a lot of the things that caused me to write that article and raise concerns about it. You mentioned at the top of this segment her describing these acts of vandalism against Tesla vehicles, which no doubt are real and are happening, and there are numerous examples of. She characterized those as terrorism. And then on Friday, she called those same attacks, specifically the ones using Molotov cocktails, she called them, quote, weapons of mass destruction. And the next thing she said really was like a blast from the past. I felt like I was in the Bush administration again. She said, quote, we are not going to negotiate with them. And so it's like, I look at this and, when I critique these things, sometimes I get a response from readers that are like, oh, why are you, we have to go after this. Why are you not taking it seriously? There are statutes on the books that you can go after people committing acts of vandalism, and with pretty stiff punishments. My point essentially is that the terrorism label is not necessary to do that. And by using the terrorism word, you're going to approach this with the mindset of somebody that is conducting counterterrorism. And you see that in how Attorney General Pam Bondi has talked about these incidents. She's talking about she said in interviews that she wants to find the people that are financing them, which is exactly what you would do if you were going after a terror organization. The problem is there's no evidence that there is some kind of organized terror organization with outside funding that's conducting these things. As far as I can tell, they're spontaneous, and the Justice Department hasn't provided any evidence to the contrary.
Yeah, if you were someone else, Ken, I would, try to rebut what you were, or not exactly rebut it, but say, well, but, for years, various Democratic lawmakers and thinkers tried to label as, I spoke at a committee hearing before the House Civil Liberties Committee years ago about how to label more kind of crazy Proud Boys style activity to be domestic terrorism, and I spoke out against why that was bad, and there was some enthusiasm to do it even among very progressive left-leaning Democratic members of Congress, and I thought that was bad. But I know, or at least presume, that you would be similarly skeptical of those measures. So it's really about consistency and not wanting to we criminalize violence, certainly, but label or exaggerate a problem of some kind of organized, funded terror effort that is not really taking place, as I agree is in this case.
Yeah, I'm sympathetic to the point that you're making, and that's the sad irony to all of this, is that it's a mirror image of how they talked about a lot of groups, the percentage, the portion of people that participated January 6th that engaged in acts of violence. When I watched that at the time, to hear it characterized as domestic terrorism just wasn't borne out by the video that I saw of them just wandering the halls, not seeming to have any particular goal in mind besides, just sort of sowing chaos. And it seemed, as far as I can tell, as far as investigators were able to discern, spontaneous acts of violence, not unlike what you're seeing now. And unfortunately, in that case, there's been a complete reversal on the part of the parties that consider these things terrorism. And my point would be, let's just calm down with the label entirely. We have plenty of laws on the books that you can use to respond to acts of vandalism that don't require you to, stomp your foot on the gas pedal, involve the FBI. And not just that, look at this through a lens or a framework that might not be borne out by the reality of what happened and end up undermining the case. Because if she's not able to find that financing that she's referred to, the terrorism case is just going to implode on itself, and they're going to have egg on their face. So even if you're someone that just, really wants people to face consequences for what's happening to these Tesla vehicles, you should want the case pursued that's likeliest to work, right?
And in relation to this affixing of the label of terrorism to these things, there is, I think, at least two separate dangers. One is the general capacity of the government to arm itself with more aggressive tools if it is fighting quote unquote terrorism than fighting regular crime, as it were. And then there's also the whole question of how that label is used, and you mentioned it in relation to supporting terrorism, how it can be used to crack down on dissent. I was struck, I don't know if you saw J.D. Vance's interview last week sometime, where he was suggesting that the Tesla stuff was financed by very rich interests, and he said, terrorism is not cheap. Well, I mean, if we're talking about graffiti terrorism as terrorism, right. Terrorism is actually quite cheap. So anyway, what's your views on all
that? I'm not trying to downplay the illegality that's clearly taking place, nor that it needs to be taken seriously. But again, do we want to go back to I call it the domestic war on terror, because it used to be the global war on terror, the responsibility of the authorities being that they had to connect acts to a foreign designated, the State Department designates a list of terror groups because it's understood that terrorism is a very serious designation to apply to something. So there's a process by which you go through that. When Pam Bondi goes on TV and says, oh, these guys are terrorists, she's not doing any of that because there is no such group, because one of the requirements of being designated a terror group is that you have to be on what's called the foreign terrorist organizations. They're only foreign groups. The reason they're careful with that is because you don't want to strip Americans of their constitutional rights, as is done in the case of foreign terror organizations. So this is all something that needs to be taken seriously and gone through with a process, which it just isn't. These things are just being thrown around with no thought at all.
And are, on that basis, I would argue, likely to or unlikely to succeed, or they're going to come up in difficulty in the court system as judges, as is already taking place, say that some of the actions being taken with respect to the deported individuals violate their due process. I talked about this today in my radar segment, that then they'll say, the government will say, well, illegal non-citizens don't necessarily have the same rights as the rest of us to due process, but then it's like, well, how do you know the people being deported are not subject to those protections unless you go through the process to determine that they are in fact not citizens? So it's a little bit of a chicken before an egg problem, I guess.
Yeah, all of this is tied together, and it affects the civil liberties that exist to anybody that lives on the soil. And I think that even if you're a citizen, you should care about that people are able to just say things and not have to worry about that. I think that contributes to a more positive environment. To me, that's what makes America a special country, and I would like to preserve that regardless of someone's status, because I just think it's going to be a better environment to live in if everybody feels free to speak their mind.
And do you see any sense of this becoming more and more expansive? I mean, is there sufficient opposition to this pressure from the Trump administration to roll back some of these efforts, or are they kind of juggernauting their way through it at the moment?
Well, again, it's sort of a mirror image of the January 6th case. If you look at what the Biden administration did then, to me, it was crazy the amount of resources that they put towards that. They had entire office. I mean, this was serious amounts of resources going towards that. And then what that means is they're not looking at what the other, terror targets were that they would have focused on, the real ones that are actually carrying out attacks. Like, let's bear in mind, none of these Tesla cases has hurt anybody. Meanwhile, there's ISIS-K there was a terror attack just 2 or 3 months ago. So terrorism is a real issue. I think we should use the resources that exist to focus on ones that might hurt people rather than acts of property violence, which, again, we have plenty of ordinary resources to be able to respond to. So when you look at the data that's come out about January 6th, the whole FBI was basically tasked with, it was something like 40% of FBI agents were put on that. And that's a real resource drain for the real stuff that exists. So that would be my concern here, because if you look at the list of cases, I mean, Bondi put out a statement pointing to 3 specific cases and that they're going to have more. So this is clearly going to be, not one, you know, one particular trial or anything. There are going to be a bunch of cases. So yeah, that's exactly my concern.
Ken Klippenstein, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.
Up next, Bill Maher is headed to the White House. We'll tell you more. Stay with us.